happen. I'm going to try that again. Good evening and welcome. I'd like to call to order the Keizer Planning Commission meeting Wednesday, August 10th at 6 p.m. We're at the Keizer Civic Center. First order of business is going all the way back to the beginning of second quarter 2022 in April. Have approval of the minutes.
I move that we approve the minutes. I move that we approve the minutes as presented.
Second.
Got a motion by Commissioner Grants and a second by Commissioner Herb to approve the minutes as presented. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed say nay. Motion passes unanimously with 2 absent. Thank you, Debbie, as always, for the great work on that. Appearance of interested citizens. Do we have anybody signed up? No. Okay. Public hearing. We don't have any of those tonight. We'll get into new old business, and we're going to be talking about climate-friendly, equitable communities rulemaking with Bill Holmstrom with DLCD. Shane, do you want to do an introduction?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Chair Lawyer. So tonight we're going to learn a little bit about the rulemaking that's been going on for quite some time. The rules recently were adopted by LCDC, Land Conservation and Development Commission. And I believe, and Bill or Evan, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the 12th is the kind of like Friday is like the in effect day?
Probably not at this point. It'll probably be sometime next week. I'm crossing my fingers.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the rules are about to go into effect. And so I had reached out to Bill a while back, and they had offered to come and present to Planning Commission or City Council or whoever we felt was appropriate. The rules there's a lot of information. I was part of the Rules Advisory Committee, went to lots and lots of Zoom meetings that were very long and I'm not smart enough, I don't think, to understand all of them adequately. But these guys are amazing. And so Bill Holmstrom's with the LCD and Evan Manville's with the LCD, and they were very gracious to show up and be here. So I'm kind of going to just turn it over to them and let them run the show. We have a presentation, which I believe Debbie printed out for you, so it's in front of you, so you don't have to feel like you got to crane your neck and look behind you or anything. But what we're hoping to do tonight is give you all a bit of an overview of what the rules are going to require of us. I'm hoping kind of some things that will be a little bit more specific to Keizer, and really give you all an opportunity to also ask questions. And I really didn't want you to ask questions of me when I was here by myself, because I do not have all the answers. And I know these guys probably don't have all the answers either, but they have a whole lot better answers than Shane has at this point in the game. So with that, I will turn it over to Bill and Evan.
Thank you. My name is Evan Manville. I'm a climate mitigation planner at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I use he, him pronouns. It's wonderful to be here. My mother-in-law lives in Keizer, and I live in Salem, so it's good to be up here talking to you about this rulemaking. This rulemaking, as Shane mentioned, was a pretty intensive 2+ years effort. We really appreciate Shane serving and helping guide it. There was a 40-person advisory committee that helped guide it, and then a bunch of community meetings out there, and staff meetings and technical advisory meetings and all sorts of things. So we're at the finish line, and now the real work begins, which is implementing, and that's in your hands, in partnership with as much as we can help you. So next slide. So why did the Land Conservation Development Commission decide to do some rulemaking on climate-friendly and equitable communities? Well, first, we're pretty far off track in meeting Oregon's climate pollution reduction goals. The legislature set some goals, and we're just not meeting them. So transportation has been particularly hard to meet our climate pollution reduction goals on, and that Oregon's not unique in struggling to meet our transportation pollution reduction goals. What we've seen, however, is real-world consequences of more extreme weather events happening more frequently. And Oregonians are losing their homes, they're losing their lives, they're losing their businesses, and that's going to increase over time unless we course correct. So climate pollution reduction is a key driver of this to benefit Oregon and meet our legislative policies. Next slide. The second big thread in the rulemaking was equity. Land use and transportation have been used for a lot of great things over history, but they've also been used as a tool of the privileged and harmed certain populations, both redlining and then in its place exclusionary zoning and other things have really concentrated wealth and helped certain populations at the expense of others. And one of the things that happens because of that is that wealth gets passed down generation to generation. So even if redlining was outlawed many decades ago, that intergenerational wealth has been passed down to those who benefited from it and were harmed by it, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why the average white household has about 10 times the wealth as the average black household, because most intergenerational wealth is house property related. So anyway, so equity is a big concern of the state of Oregon and a thrust of this rulemaking. Next slide. These rules update Oregon's land use transportation planning rules in just the metro areas in Oregon. Just the 8 metro areas, Salem, Keizer is one of them. It's where most people live, where most transportation pollution happens, and where we thought we could get the biggest bang for our buck. Next slide. There are 2 thrusts of the rulemaking. The commission said, hey, we want to do a couple of things. One is we really liked what, the general effort of the Portland metro region to work together to say, hey, how can we as a region choose the right set of tools to achieve our pollution reduction targets? So let's do that in other regions. The second is just updating Oregon's core land use and transportation rules and say, hey, those haven't quite been getting us to our goals. Let's tweak those. Let's strengthen those to reduce pollution and promote equity. So those are the 2 thrusts. Last slide for me, I think. So this is just a sense of how big transportation is and how these pieces all fit together, roughly. Climate pollution has all sorts of different sources, as you all know. Transportation is the largest source in Oregon. It's about 38% of our pollution. And so to cut transportation pollution, we have to make vehicles cleaner and more efficient. We also have to figure out ways we can cut the amount people have to drive. So reducing miles traveled, there's a cross-agency effort called Every Mile Counts that kind of says, hey, how can we give people options so not everyone has to get and drive a long distance for every trip. So the state, we have an effort. We have regional scenario plans within that. And then we have local transportation system plans and development codes. So all that kind of bundles together and adds up. And then there are a bunch of other state efforts that I'm not going to talk about here. But so the local transportation system plans, development codes, comp plans are a piece of the puzzle to Oregon's largest pollution problem when it comes to climate pollution. Next slide. Okay, we'll talk about scenario planning.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. Thank you for having me here. Bill Holmstrom, I'm the agency's Land Use and Transportation Planning Coordinator at DLCD. And we're just 2 of a group of many people at our agency working with folks across other state agencies to do this work. So we're very happy to be here today. But I will be clear that this part I'm about to talk about is not the area where I'm the lead staff. So I'm going to try to do my best to give you this information. So our commission was tasked by the legislature about a dozen years ago or so now to set emissions or climate pollution reduction targets for each of Oregon's 8 metropolitan areas. That's the Portland metropolitan area, and of course here in the Keizer-Salem metropolitan area, and then there's 6 other metropolitan areas across the state that are meeting these rules and then also have these targets. These targets have been around, like I said, about a dozen years. They've been updated once since they were initially set. And these have to do with, it's complicated, but it's basically reductions of per capita, so per person, light vehicle emissions in that metropolitan area. So these don't include things like big trucks. They don't include marine or aviation, things like that. So we're just talking about that kind of household segment of transportation. And these targets are based on a lot of other assumptions that we know that there's going to be more and more electric vehicles on the road, things like that. So these targets take those things into consideration. Some of these things are part of those targets, some of those things are not part of these targets. But I just want to let you know this is something that the state's been working on for about a dozen years. So in these metropolitan areas, there's going to be kind of two branches. One is going through a regional scenario planning process. Here in Keizer, along with Salem and Marion County, you're going to be working on that over the next couple years here, is putting together a regional scenario plan. It's something that we've done in the Portland metropolitan area about 10 years ago. They've put together a big scenario planning process. The Eugene Springfield area was required to do this process as well. They were not required to adopt it, so they'll be working on this, putting the final touches on that, doing some land use pieces to that, and adopting that these next couple years as well, along with the Salem and Keizer areas. So that scenario planning process will get you to a place where, and I'll talk a little bit more in the next couple slides about the details, but it'll get you to a place where you have a range of performance targets that you're trying to hit. You're trying to hit this overall percentage, and how you get there is how you're going to have some choices about how you get there at the end. And I have a couple slides here that talk about how that works. That's going to cascade down into some local performance measures that will then be something that the City of Keizer will then work on in your local plan. How do we do our part to build up to that regional part, build up to the state goals? The other 6 metropolitan areas around the state will be doing something a little bit different. They'll be doing something called a regional assessment, where they'll be taking a look at where their plans are getting them now, what the gaps are, and how they can close those gaps. Sometime down the road, our commission may ask those other metropolitan areas to do this scenario planning process as well. We're just going to see how this goes in Eugene and Keizer here, and then depending on the resources available, move those into the other parts of the state. So here's a little bit of how the scenario planning process works. And again, I'm not the lead planner on this, so I'm probably not speaking as eloquently as my colleague would on this, but to put together, you start working together with your partners across the region to establish kind of a framework for what are the different tools that we have available to make progress, evaluate each of those against a set of criteria that you set. Then you'll evaluate where you're at now, or where you're at in the base year, which I don't know, I don't remember exactly when that is. It may have been in the past, it may be now. And then look at where different options might get you to in the future, look at different scenarios, different options, because there's choices that you'll have to make. You're going to select a preferred scenario out of those options, and then you'll implement that through your local planning process. And you'll continue to monitor that periodically to see how you're doing and if you need to make tweaks along the way. So here's an example, which is maybe a little bit helpful to understand what exactly we're talking about here. There's, on the left side of the slide there, you can see 7 different tools, different levers you can move and say, okay, where can we put investment in the active transportation, in the fleet and fuels? That's, if there's local investments you can make in making sure that cars are cleaner, basically, in transit service, in pricing, that's parking, that's other pricing, which probably doesn't happen so much down here, parking management, education, marketing, and roads. And in each of those, what can we do in each of those that gets us to our goal? And there's going to be multiple different options. You could say, well, we really want to do a lot of transit here, and that's going to get us this percentage of the way, then we don't need to do so much of this other stuff. Or maybe you choose something else, and it's going to be up to each individual region what that looks like and what that scenario ends up being. So that this is a tool for you to work locally to figure out what's the best way to get to where we're going to meet those overall goals. And you can see there on the right there's an example of, the reference scenario, which is like where our plans get us now. And for an example, in this case, it would be 3%, but in our preferred scenario, we're getting to meet our target. So that's all I have to say about the regional scenario planning part of that. And there's going to be a lot of action on that in the next couple of years here. There's going to be an opportunity for the city to work over the next 9 months or so with your partners to put together a work program for what that looks like. and how that's going to roll out. So there's still more to come on that. The other piece of the rulemaking that our commission directed us to do is to update our land use and transportation rules. We have a thing at the state called the Transportation Planning Rules. It's been on the books for about 30 years here in Oregon. It's directed how every community in the state does local coordinated land use and transportation planning. Keizer has a plan, most cities have a plan called a transportation system plan. That rule tells you how you put that plan together. We have updated those rules for these cities within the metropolitan areas. I like to say we're turning up the volume a little bit. We've done a lot of good work over the years. Keizer's done a lot of good work over the years, moving things in the right direction. I don't want to say that, I hate to say, that, I always like to say that because I don't like to say, we haven't been doing a good job, because we have. I think Oregon's in a much better place if we didn't have these rules. But we know we need to do more. Like Evan said, we haven't been meeting our goals. So in general categories, they fit into a couple different buckets. We have a thing that we're asking local governments to adopt called climate-friendly areas. You can call it something different if you want to. Basically, these are places similar to my understanding of what you've been working on in some of these river road overlay districts, where you are permitting a higher level of development, intensity. These are places that are downtowns, and I'll talk a little bit more in those slides about that. We'll talk a little bit, and Evan will talk a little bit more about reforming parking management and how parking requirements work in jurisdictions. And we want to make sure that we're supporting electric vehicles. In transportation planning, we want to make sure that we're continuing to plan for high-quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit infrastructure, going beyond just a sole focus of looking at motor vehicle congestion, looking at a range of different ways of measuring success in our transportation system, and that we're prioritizing and selecting projects that meet our climate and equity outcome. So a little bit about climate-friendly areas, and again, this is a topic area that I have another staff member who's the lead on this, but I'll do my best. So I think the best way to think about these are kind of like downtowns. Or neighborhood centers in your community. They're walkable places with a mix of uses, residential, make sure there's lots of housing there, as well as jobs, services, retail, and public uses, all sorts of different uses. There's high quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit networks in those places, and we have well-managed parking. The idea is we want more people to be able to live in places where they don't have to drive to meet their daily needs. Sometimes you have to drive, and that's fine. We're not saying don't drive. We're saying you should be able to meet more of your daily needs without having to hop into a car. There's too many places in our country, in our state, where we all know you've got to hop in a car to pretty much do everything. And so we need to make, and there's still lots of places like that, but we need more places where people have a choice. So that's really what this is about. In general, we want to make sure that we're designating enough of these places to make sure that we're accommodating or can accommodate in the future 30% of the community's housing needs. So about 30% of the people that live in this community can have the ability to live in one of these places. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen, that the development's going to happen that way. We're going to try to support that as much as possible, but we want to make sure that possibility is there. And that comes from the statewide transportation strategy, which was adopted by the Oregon Transportation Commission, which oversees ODOT. When they did that plan about 10 years ago, they said, this is what we need, this is what the state of Oregon needs in order to get to where we're going. The areas might include other high density or employment areas nearby. And there's a couple different ways that we have options for local governments to meet the requirements for a climate-friendly area. And I'll be honest with you, this is a little bit beyond me right here. But you can see there in the population scales, I believe Keizer would be in that third row there, in the 25 to 49. And so you need to have a climate-friendly area that fits about 30% of housing. And that really is about capacity. It's not that that's where 30% is today. That's not necessarily that 30% is going to happen, but that you're zoning enough capacity for that to happen in the future. And then there's a couple different options. We have a prescriptive option where you would be required to allow 20 dwelling units per net acre as a minimum density in there, and have building heights of no less than 60 feet in the primary CFA. And then if you have a multiple climate-friendly areas, you can actually have less in some other places. And then you have an outcomes option, which is really aiming at 30 homes and jobs per net acre. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Evan.
Thank you. Parking. One of the key pieces of this rulemaking is reforming how we manage parking mandates. And why do we do that? Generally, communities across the country are realizing that they're kind of one-size-fits-all things that don't really take into account the diversity of developments having a diversity of demand for parking. And that when you deregulate parking and get the government out of the way, the market tends to do a pretty decent job of providing adequate parking. Because the one-size-fits-all mandates have lots of costs as well. Like they provide some conflict management, I would say, and that's in part why cities have used them. Like it's easy to say everyone should do this. But they also crowd things out that we want. They crowd out housing. You need roughly 300 square feet of land for an off-street parking space and the drive aisles. So that's a lot of possible land. They cost a lot of money, thousands of dollars to build. And they tend to be underused. Because we have a lot of it everywhere, we tend to have too much. And so when we've gone out and done utilization studies on how much is being used, you see on average 25 to 30% of it is overbuilt. So the parking mandates, that the approach from the past hasn't been working. On the equity side, parking mandates also mean that those people who own fewer cars and drive less subsidize those who drive. Because the cost of parking in roughly anywhere, at least here in Oregon, particularly in Keizer, like you're not paying separately for the parking. You don't pay for parking when you go to the grocery store. You don't, pay, et cetera, et cetera. But you are paying for parking, as are the people who don't drive there. You're paying because the cost of goods are a little bit higher because the grocery store is providing parking for you. So it's bundled with other goods, it's hidden with that, and the non-drivers are subsidizing the drivers. So that's an equity issue because people who are poor tend to own fewer cars and drive less. So that lots of different reasons why we think taking on parking is an important thing we can do to help meet our climate and equity goals. Next slide. Parking is also a huge land use. So when we think about land use planning, you take it apart and you're like, wow, parking is like 10 to 20% of all the land in the city. The off-street parking is a bunch, maybe 10%. The on-street parking can go 5 to 10% of all the land because we have a lot of parking spaces everywhere. So what that does is it pushes uses apart and it makes areas less walkable. And if we're actually going to give people feasible ways to get around without driving, they need to be pleasant and feel safe to walk in. And so the more we push in parking, the more hostile it is to people who want to have other options. A last thing to note on this, on why we're doing this, is parking mandates do actually increase how much people own cars and drive. People often say, hey, people are going to drive regardless of what the parking is. And both the academic research and kind of common sense economics says if you provide a lot of something for free, people will consume more of it. I did that when I was in college and went to free pizza parties. People do that with parking too. So if it's a little bit harder to find or it sometimes has a price to it, people will consume less of it. And so that's really, it doesn't change most trips, but it changes some number of trips, and that's helping in meeting our goals. So lots of reasons why we decided to take this on. Next slide. So what we proposed and worked with our advisory committee on and worked lots of iterations through is we say, hey, the literature says, and cities that have done reform said, near frequent transit, let's not have parking mandates. Cities can leave that up to the market, and let's encourage development near those areas and give people the option to build in those areas without providing off-street parking. That's a half mile within frequent transit. I don't know the Chariot's routes up here well enough to know which routes those were. Maybe Bill does. But yeah, so that's one core piece of the parking reform. The other piece of where we're saying cities, you don't do mandates is kind of the equity things, domestic violence shelters, single room occupancy housing, childcare facilities for people with disabilities, affordable housing. Let those people decide how much parking they need, because certain of those uses they'll serve a certain population. They're like, hey, our people need parking, we'll build it. But don't have this kind of government saying everyone needs to build X, 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 because X doesn't fit everywhere. So that sort of use. And then we put a cap on multifamily mandates. Again, builders can build as much as they want, pretty much, but cities can't require more than one off-street space per unit of multifamily development. So those are some core things that are in the rules. The second piece is that cities choose an approach from there. So that covers a certain percentage of the city and a certain number of uses in the city. But what's next? And we say cities, you have communities, cities and counties. You have three options. One is to say, hey, we're going to deregulate parking. Again, dozens of communities around the world and in America have done that, and it's worked pretty well. So we kind of, like, that kind of is best practice, and a lot of people think. But we realize not all cities are ready for that. So there are a couple of other options. One is to just, option two here says, hey, we've got those core reforms, and then let's just nudge parking on equity. Do 3 of these 5 policies. One is unbundled parking for residential, which means you rent your parking space separate from your unit. So those people who don't own cars, and 1 in 6 Oregon tenant households doesn't own a car, they don't have to pay for parking anymore. Because it would be like, no, you can't charge me for that parking space I don't use. The same for commercial. So that's unbundling for commercial. A third is called flexible commute benefits. So if your employer is providing you a parking space and you don't use it, you can say, well, that cost you $40 to provide that space, give me the $40 instead. Yeah, and there are 2 others that are, one is a tax on commercial parking lots, and the other is reducing your multifamily mandates down to a half space per unit. So choose 3 of those 5 that work for you, and then you've met this choice. And the third option, if you don't want to do either of those 2, is just a few more uses that are added into that. Historic buildings sometimes have run into problems with parking reform. So historic buildings, schools, places near climate-friendly areas. So it kind of expands the reform, but it doesn't do either of those 2 options, the first 2 options. So that's kind of the outline of the parking reform. It's pretty significant. But it's also what a lot of communities are doing. You know, downtown Madras said, hey, we're going to repeal our parking mandates for downtown. Banks, City of Salem, like a lot of people, this isn't just some, conspiracy. A lot of people are realizing this is best practice. Next slide. There are other kind of wonky parking provisions, but I do want to draw your attention to the image on in this slide. This could be pretty much any downtown in Oregon. The red is the parking, just the off-street parking, not the on-street parking. Downtowns are particularly pushed apart by lots of parking. So it's like, this is a huge land use. It really is eating up spaces and preventing businesses and housing and other things from being built there. So again, not to pick on Corvallis, Klamath Falls looks the same way, and Salem, and fill in the blank. But you can do that exercise and kind of get a sense mentally of how much land parking uses. I'm being a little long-winded because I know parking is a pretty contentious issue, and so I'm trying to get into the details, and happy to take questions. So the other things they do are kind of really more technical things that parking codes tend to do, talking about shared parking, converting underused parking, dealing with large parking lots, how you count parking spaces, things that we kind of looked through codes throughout Oregon and found some best practices and said everyone should be doing this. And we had some other ones that fell off because people didn't say everyone shouldn't do that. And a limited number of parking maximum codes. There's something specific for the 6 or 7 largest, most populous communities that doesn't apply to Keizer, so I won't go into that. But that's kind of the parking reforms in a nutshell, why and what they contain. So it's going to be in a lot of parking. A lot of Keizer won't have parking mandates anymore at the end of this year. Those things near transit and equity uses, those that go into effect for development applications starting at the start of next year. Yeah.
So we just went through a bunch of stuff, and we actually had some parking in there. You're saying within a half mile of transit, does that mean where the bus is at, or where the bus stop is at, or where the buses are located at? Because there probably isn't any place in Keizer that's, outside of a half mile of a bus route.
Yeah.
Anyway. My question is are we actually saying now that anybody within a half mile of a bus route, we being Keizer, if I want to build a home or I want to build a commercial building, you can't force me to have parking on that?
Thank you for the question, and Commissioner Pearson. The provisions are for frequent transit, and the frequent transit means a headway 4 times or more an hour during peak service. Keizer has some routes of that, yeah. So those within a half mile of a transit corridor that has frequent transit defined by that, that's correct. That the city.
That's a large portion of Keizer, since River Road is one of those corridors.
Yeah.
And probably so is like Berta or
Yeah,
Lock Haven, so that's a pretty big swath.
Yeah, I think, I don't know the transit routes off the top of my head. I know in looking at the rules, that's something that I've kind of tried to figure out and analyze with some of the processes that we will be taking on in the near future. That is one of the things that, I think you're right. I think that most of our routes are I think they're rated at 15-minute routes, which meets that definition in the rules. And I think that's, we kind of have a main route that's River Road, and it loops up north and comes back down and down Lock Haven. So with that half mile, because we're pretty lineal and we're a pretty small footprint city, it has a big impact.
Well, and you have an apartment complex that's going to be there on Verta right now. And I'm assuming that they have plans in with you, they have pictures, they have plans in with you. And those plans included the old rules that, required so much parking places. Are we saying that now they don't have to build those parking places?
Well, they won't be subject to these rules because the parking rules go into effect, Evan, help me, but it's December this year or January?
December 31st,
so it's the end of this year that those will go into effect. So my anticipation is that we'll be back at Planning Commission soon in the fall sometime to do some text amendments to parking based on these new rules.
But those same people, they could reapply underneath the new rules?
I mean, we'll get that in the staff report. Actually, that's one of the things I was going to kind of share out with y'all. I have the permits for that project on my desk right now. I'm reviewing them. So no, they're already in. They'll be building their buildings before then. So, and I think the one thing to point out, I mean, Evan kind of said it, these are, our code says, hey, here's the minimum that you have to provide. And so I regulate that with a building permit, and I have to quantify for us, hey, how many units, how many spaces does that require, how many square feet based on certain uses. We have the big giant chart that we've changed a million times over the years. So, I mean, realistically, the approach that Keizer takes in kind of this 1, 2, or 3, and I've looked at them pretty close, and with the way that the rules are structured, I'm not sure how much of a difference it will make in some regards. We don't have on-street parking in Keizer, so pricing parking is a little bit of a tool we can't really use the way we're set up currently. So there's some nuance there. But realistically, a developer, they come in and they propose a parking lot because they want to provide parking. They still can do that. We don't say you can't provide parking other than kind of the maximums that are outlined. So does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
And thank you, Shane. Thank you, Commissioner Wilson. And just to add onto that a little bit, we do have data from communities that have done this a decade ago or longer. And what they found is that in Buffalo, for example, the single-use residential pretty much built what they would have built under the old rules, because that was, pretty well aligned, on average. But mixed-use developments were providing about 50 or 60% of what they would have had to before. So it really is the market adjusting. And the thing that I've learned in parking reform is that the lenders are driving a lot of this. So for the larger developments, the lenders, they're risk averse and they like the models that they know work. And those models tend to include a lot of parking from the past. So the amount of parking that's going to be built will change somewhat over time in a very nuanced way. That's the experience other communities have had that have done this sort of parking reform. I don't want to say that there won't be some areas where there's not enough parking and there's spillover parking. That happens under most parking codes now, where you have event peaks or other peaks. But I also want to realize that a lot of other factors are going to drive parking provision other than the government telling you developers that they have to build it. There is pretty good data from other communities that have done that, demonstrating that. Anyway, other questions on that? We can come back to it later too if I want to get through the presentation. Okay. So electric vehicle charging. The legislature kind of took this issue that was on the cusp of land use or building code, what is it? And they put most of it into building code. So building codes division is pretty much responsible for this. The legislature said, land use people, you can change the percentage of parking spaces that need to be served by electrical conduit. So what these rules say is 40% of spaces in new multifamily and mixed use have to have the conduit built in, because that's the time when it's super cheap to build the conduit. You don't have to actually put in wiring. You don't actually have to put in EV charging. But if we're building buildings for the next 80 or 100 years, let's put the pipes in the ground before we cement it in. And that's really 10 times as cheap as retrofitting it. So this is kind of future-proofing buildings for what we believe will be the EV transformation over X number of years. Who knows how long, but whenever it comes, then they can put in the wiring and the EV chargers. So that's a relatively minor thing. The building codes just adopted something saying 20% as of July 1st this year. So this is just kind of adding it on for these places where people are most likely to charge, which is at home. That's where people charge their EVs more than anywhere else, is overnight at home. So that's what that does.
Thank you, Evan. So again, Bill Holmstrom. I'm going to talk real quick about transportation system planning. Like I said, Keizer and communities all around the state have been doing this work for decades here in Oregon, adopting a transportation system plan as part of your comprehensive plan to coordinate how your transportation systems work together with your planned land uses. The changes that we're making to the rules include stronger requirements and stronger planning for our pedestrian, bicycle, and public transportation networks. Those requirements are there today. You're doing that planning, it's good. We're just kind of, like I said, turning it up a little bit. That doesn't mean you don't plan for cars, you don't plan for highways, you don't plan for freight. Obviously, we need to make sure that we have a complete transportation network, that there are connected, safe, and complete networks for all those modes of travel. We've done a really good job in this country of building out that network for cars. But I think in this community and communities and where I live and lots of places, there's places where there are missing sidewalks, where you don't have bike lanes, where there's no transit service. There are gaps in those networks. So it's really about paying attention to those gaps. In particular, we want to make sure that we're prioritizing those climate-friendly areas we talked about, where we want to make sure that we have places where people can live. We don't necessarily have to drive a car to get around to meet their daily needs. We want to make sure that we're paying attention, special attention to those neighborhoods with underserved populations. Those are places where we've made investments in the past that maybe have been harmful, where there's been a lack of investment in those neighborhoods sometimes. We want to make sure that we're paying attention to the people that live there, we're listening to them, we're talking to them, that they're talking to us, that we are making investments in those places that are going to be helpful and beneficial to those neighborhoods. And in particular, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to providing access to key destinations in the community so people can get to whether they're shopping, to medical appointments, to school, to work, whatever it is they're doing to meet their daily needs, that they're able to get there. So specifically, some of the changes that we're making, we're kind of turning up the requirements for inventories of the transportation network, making sure that we're looking at the existing conditions of the network, looking at key destinations where those are and gaps in the systems. We want to make sure that we're planning for a complete low-stress network of and prioritizing projects to help complete those gaps. We have we have requirements for bicycle parking now. We're turning those up, again, adding some to that. And then we're asking local governments to identify those priority transit corridors. That's something I know that, together with Chariots, that a lot of work's already been done on identifying those in Keizer and Salem. In terms of project selection within your transportation system plan, this is something that you already do. We're just kind of outlining some different ways of doing that. We want to make sure that when you're doing that, your project lists work together to help meet the climate and equity goals that you've set for yourself. That when you are looking at how the transportation system is functioning, that you're looking at multiple measures, not just moving cars. Right now, pretty much everyone in the state looks at one or two different ways of how many cars move through an intersection during a peak hour. That's about it. That tells you something, and it's not unimportant, and we're not saying get rid of that. We're saying, well, look at something else too, and that might be safety, that might be access, that might be connectivity, that might be looking at the other modes of travel, of getting around. And then for significant street or highway expansions, these are pretty big projects. We have just a additional process in there before it's part of that plan that you're reviewing alternatives. You're really looking at what are the things that we can do other than this whole big thing to meet the need. Are there other things that we can do? And we do have some engagement requirements along with that. So I think with that, we're going to talk a little bit about how we're moving forward. Like I said, like we said earlier, the rules have been adopted. They're about to be filed with the Secretary of State, and then they will be effective. That's imminent. So real soon here. In the Salem-Keizer area, we're going to be working with you closely on the regional scenario plan. That's something that Evan and Cody Meyer with our staff have been working with the COG, Mid-Willamette Valley Council of Governments, on helping us to staff that work and put that together. Talking with leaders in Keizer and in Salem, we had initially said that we would put Eugene Springfield first because they'd already done some of this work. They wanted to go a little bit later because of other things that they've going on. You guys kind of want to go a little bit sooner because of some other things you got going on. So that's kind of how we're arranging it. But like I said, over the next 9 months or so, we'll have an opportunity to really sit down, work with your staff and folks from all your communities about what are all the different pieces that need to happen here, and when can that happen. The state has resources available through our agency and through the Department of Transportation to help support that. So we want to make sure that we line all those things up, that we're talking to the Eugene people as well, and that we're going to line everything up and get that put together in a way that makes sense for everybody. The Portland metropolitan area is doing their thing. They adopted a scenario plan a couple years ago, and then they're doing their next big update of their regional transportation plan that they do on a 4 to 5 year cycle. This is their first big update that they've done since they did that scenario plan originally, so we're going to be working with them on what that looks like, making sure that they've been making the progress that they thought they were going to be making. And the performance measures, that has to do with those other 5 metropolitan areas around the state. Climate-friendly areas, the way we've structured that is the next year plus, we're going to be working with local governments, and there's 15 affected local governments, including Keizer, around the state, on a study. And we're already talking again with the Council of Governments to help us with that work. And we have resources available to provide funding to do that study. Just to look, just to see what's there today, what's on the ground, this community's already done a lot of work in the River Road and the Cherry corridors to do some of this type of work. What's the gap between what you've already done and what you need to do? Maybe it's not that much. We'll take a look. How much land will you need to have to get to that 30% target? It's a little bit confusing here because you have a shared urban growth boundary with the city of Salem and with Marion County. So there'll be some work to figure out who does what, how does everyone have to do there. And then the year after that, in the 23 to 24 range, we're going to be working with local governments to implement your choices for where those areas are. What's like I said, what's the gap between what you've got now, what you need to do, and helping to make amendments to your codes to make those happen. And then we'll be working again with Department of Transportation to do some of the transportation planning requirements that are attached to those areas, just to make sure that we're looking at gaps in those networks, in those areas, to make sure that we've identified where we need to make investments in those places so that we can put, the next time you do your transportation system plan update, you're able to prioritize those. Like Evan talked about, there's some timelines along with the parking reform and the EV conduit. Some of those are coming up at the end of this year, and then there's some that go into next year. There's a whole range of different things that happen at different times. By the end of this next January, I just want to point out, there are some of these timelines that can be adjusted, and actually in Keizer and Salem, it's actually a little bit later. It's July because of the work program with the scenario planning. So you have a little bit more time than some other communities to work with our agency to maybe adjust some of these timelines if that's necessary, just to make sense with everything else that you're doing, whether it's part of this work or some other work that your community is doing. Every place is different. And we're going to be working, we have enhanced requirements for inventorying the current state of the transportation system, particularly the pedestrian and bicycle systems. We're going to be, and communities are in all different places with this. Some places have a lot of good information, some places don't have that. We're working closely with ODOT, and they've identified funding to help local governments do that inventory work, and to help build databases that are consistent across the state so they'll be interoperable. So that'll be mostly led by ODOT on that, but that's a great thing for local governments that they're going to be able to do that. And then moving forward, and I know this is something that communities here is interested in doing, is a transportation system plan updates to meet the updated rules. And that's going to be in the next couple of years here. Once you've done some of this other work, you will be wanting to update your transportation system plan to meet the updated rules, and we'll be continuing to work with local governments into the future to continue to do that. And the state, of course, for decades has been supporting that work, and we've got additional funding that ODOT's received to support some of this additional work moving forward as well. So I think with that, we're at the end. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
All right, Bill and Evan, thank you very much. Commissioners, any questions? Nothing. We're all experts on it now. Just out of curiosity, one of the things that COVID taught us is that telework is a very tangible option for a lot of industries. Has there been any analysis, because this started a couple of years ago, BC, before COVID, and has there been any analysis to see what the increase in teleworking has done in terms of maybe lowering or identifying some of those greenhouse goals? Because you got a lot less people driving, a lot less people.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, the modelers I've talked to said they didn't want to guess. that they're worried that it might be a short-term dip or a lag, and they didn't want to predict long-term. One of the things to note is that the commute to work is only about 1 out of every 5 trips. So as far as overall numbers of miles driven and other things, a lot of the other trips are huge portions of that pie as well. But The modelers, I said, were like, we're going to wait until it settles. So they didn't have great answers. They're more cautious than me, who wants an immediate answer. So unfortunately, I don't have much to add to that. But
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The only thing I'd say is in the Portland area in particular, they've discovered that those peaks, particularly the afternoon peak, has spread out a lot. So it's not so much that you've got that hour of really heavy traffic, you've got kind of more traffic in the middle of the day, kind of spread out, and because, like Evan said, some of the work trips have reduced, but that means people sometimes are running errands and things at times they wouldn't have been able to before because they were at work. So there's some shifts that are happening, and it's all kind of still in flux, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future.
I'd just be curious, and this is purely an academic study, I'd be curious to talk to the state motor pool and look what their average miles traveled per year were in like 2018 versus what they've experienced in the last 2 years. And that might give you just a small model to look at, but I can bet you it's fairly significantly reduced.
yeah.
Just on the fleet. I mean, it might give you a small sense, but I can tell you, I work downtown, and my commute is very different than it was 3 years ago.
Yeah, I certainly hear about that concern from downtown businesses that have focused on office workers who might not be there as well. And some of that is, but people are coming up with other things like increasing outdoor dining, like converting parking, and now the restaurant can be bigger and people like eating outdoors. And yeah, a lot of things to figure out. So.
And I have one final question. When you talk about the, and I'm going to get it wrong, the climate-friendly areas, spaces, I can't remember exactly what you called it. So since Salem and Keizer and a portion of Marion County share an urban growth boundary, is it a collective UGB look, or are you looking specific within each city limit? Because based off my calculations, we're looking at 250 acres approximately that we'd have to look at that.
You wanna-
So, right before, this afternoon, we talked with our colleague who is he works more with the housing side of things, and he's the lead planner on the climate-friendly area, and he rattled off a whole lot of stuff that I'm now a little bit like, okay, what did he say exactly? There's a, what's it called, a housing needs analysis? That's the old, that's HCA is the new name. Yeah, so there's a housing capacity analysis that each jurisdiction has done. My understanding that Keizer has one that's done relatively recently, and that will put you in, it'll make it relatively easy to figure out for Keizer what the need's going to be. And in terms of acreage, it's really going to depend on what level of intensity you're assuming that area is going to have or be able to support for housing units. And there's some guidelines in the rules, but that's like a floor, not a ceiling. So, I think TBD, but that's why we've kind of structured it as a study to start off with, to say, what is it that you guys are going to need? How many units are we talking about in X year in the future in terms of a percentage of the total that we expect to need in the future? And what does that look like? And there might be different options you look at in terms of locations, in terms of concentration, and you'll have some choices to make about that, what that looks like.
Thank you. Commissioner Burson.
So Shane, I have a question on the EV conduit. I mean, we're going to talk about that with multifamily. Is that correct? Is there any talk about putting that in just a building code with a single family home?
Not that I'm aware of, but I don't follow the building codes really. But yeah, I think it's strictly for the multifamily stuff. But I don't know, Evan, do you?
Yeah, both the rules and at both the state building code that the legislature passed and said in state building code, this has to go in state building code, and our rules are not focused on single family or 2 to 4 unit housing.
So my question is, that's not something that's in the permit then for building a new home?
No, not currently.
Okay, so you have no idea if homes are being built right now with putting in-home chargers in?
No.
And I just want to piggyback on that. So you're dealing with the various LIFT programs and stuff that Oregon Housing Community Services has. If this is going to be something that's implemented, I think that it needs to be addressed through either DEQ or DLCD or something, because the goal of those units in all cases is to be affordable. And I can imagine at some point that's probably going to be very expensive, especially with the cost of materials in the current economic climate that we have. So I think you just need to be thoughtful about sort of that cross-pollination between agencies. So you're being thoughtful about, you know, you have an affordable unit, right, in terms of what the expectations of it are, but now there's this other set of sort of standards that a community needs to adopt that may change the goalpost just a little bit, but, you know, it's make it make sense, right? So you're cross-pollinating in your communication, making sure that it, you know, you think you're going to spend $8 million on a project, but it's going to cost another $500,000. Well, that changes significantly depending on the size of the unit of what the cost would be for those ultimate cost per unit issues.
No, it's a well-taken comment. I appreciate that. We certainly have significant expertise on our commission on both the cost of developing housing and the needs around affordable housing. And I think that the rules started at a much more aggressive level, having chargers and wiring and things like that, and got scaled back to just that very, just the, PVC tube in the wall. So for in part that reason, and for other legal reasons, but we're certainly aware that there can be a tension there. And yeah, we had a 40-person advisory committee, a lot of equity, a lot of people who lead with equity. So certainly well taken comment.
Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair Lawyer. And I'd like to kind of add on to that too, because you talked about equity where drivers or non-drivers are subsidizing drivers who are using the parking amenities. And it seems like we're sort of doing the same thing here, where now we're subsidizing EV drivers by the non-EV drivers or people who can't afford to have an EV. So equity seems to be sort of lost here too.
No, I think there are a lot of the details to be worked out in the leases and other things. When I was talking to various people who work in this, they said, okay, some of the units are going to pay extra to have one of the designated parking spaces where they can have EV, and they, and they can be metered, and they pay for that electricity. So we felt that the rules were more nuanced before we were limited in how nuanced they could be through statute. But yeah, they losing my train of thought a little bit. Yeah, when we looked at the trends in EV consumption and the goal to have 90 or 100% of all vehicles sold in Oregon, new vehicles sold in Oregon, to be electric by 2035, it felt like putting in an 80 to 100 year building, spending the money now, was a smart investment to save costs down the line. So, trying to, there's not an easy way to, ideally it would be just as easy to retrofit it tomorrow as it is to build it today, but that wasn't. So that's kind of a temporal equity or temporal cost issue that, we made a judgment call on it. But I hear your point. So,
Okay.
yeah.
And it's maybe the wealthier people who are getting subsidized yet again, who can afford EVs. But, and also the electricity that's going to be powering the EVs, where is that electricity being generated? Is that coal? Is it fossil fuels? And so is that actually helping the climate by having all of these electric vehicles charged by electricity that's generated elsewhere?
No, Commissioner Erb, I appreciate that. And certainly we've had significant conversations internally on some people who said, oh, if we just get EVs, we've solved the problem. I was like, no. No, it's a small portion. It's an additive thing where we need to do EVs and a lot of other things to reduce pollution. Certainly the state and the legislature passed various things to clean up our electric sources. So while a significant, but not majority of Oregon's existing electricity comes from coal and other dirty sources, we're on a pretty good trajectory over the next 15, 20 years to really clean that up. And we think overall it's a net benefit. But so certainly the people who think EVs solve pollution and everything else, that's not what we're trying to say here. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's better than the alternative, and but yeah, it has a lot of costs as well. I've talked too long. Sorry.
Mo's like, it's 7 o'clock, time to go.
Commissioner.
All right, anything else? Any other thoughts? And obviously, if we have anything that comes up, we'll just email Shane and he'll do the research as he always does and get back to us.
I'll have all the answers.
Yeah. You always do, even if you don't know. All right. Well, if that's it, Bill and Evan, again, thank you for your time this evening. It's good to hear this. It would have been really interesting to hear sort of where it started and how we got here, and I think Shane did his best to sort of summarize it. Yeah, thank you for taking the time out this evening and coming to chat with us.
Yeah, thanks for your service to the city and your work.
All right. Thank you, guys. All right, moving on. Shane. I mean, we've been gone for like 6 months, so something had to have happened, right? There's like a big development happening on River Road north of Lock Haven. Like, what's going on in the world today?
Yeah, so that was loud. I'm pretty loud normally, and that was extra hot. I'll just kind of push that back a little bit. Yeah, there's just a few things I wanted to kind of keep you up to date on. Obviously, Chick-fil-A opened last week.
Go to Chicken Shack. Sorry. Go ahead.
I agree. I eat all.
Is that in Keizer?
What's that?
Keizer Station, yeah.
I thought that was actually in the Shimano
No.
land, but it's our land.
Well, we don't own it. The Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and Siletz own the land, but it's within the city limits of Keizer, yes.
Okay.
So that opened up last week. That was going on for a while there. Obviously, we've seen some movement in that area being developed out, so that's kind of exciting. As I said earlier, when it was asked, the permits came in finally for the apartment complex proposed at Verda and Shamawa. The cow property, as many of us affectionately have referred to it for years. So those permits are in review. Then it's 112 units. That was a comp plan zone change that was done way back in 2014. That case started, and then it got held up, and there was an appeal and a remand, and I think ultimately the ordinance got signed in 2016. So, 6 years later, dirt's going to start moving and structures are going to start going up. So that's kind of a big deal. That's kind of been a long time coming, and for those of us who've been around a long time, it's going to look a lot different. I think their design is nice. They're doing heavy landscaping, some good mitigations. They are going to be doing a sign that, Debbie, help me, was it Points of Interest Committee or was it Art Commission? Okay, so the Points of Interest Committee, back when the comp plan zone change was done, they kind of came up with a sign that's going to be installed on the outside of the facility. There's actually a wall that's going to be there next to the sidewalk retaining wall. So the plan is to put this sign up that has a picture of the old Pew Herber house, the homestead house that got demolished years back, with a timeline. The Keizer Times had done an article back then, and so the Points of Interest Committee said, hey, this is kind of what we think would be nice for a identifier. So they've kind of highlighted a place for that to be where people can see that from the public walkway as they go by. So that's kind of cool. The other thing is, Mr. Lawyer, you had mentioned there is less trees up on North River Road, kind of up the hill. That's a 66-unit apartment complex that's being proposed to be built there. So that's within our River Cherry Overlay District, mixed use. That's like, just for a frame of reference, we heard some different numbers thrown out there, like climate-friendly areas, minimum density of 20 units per acre, 60-foot building heights. That's kind of the metric for us. That development is sitting at about 28 units an acre. Their building heights they're proposing there are 3-story, but they're not 60 feet. 3 stories normally like 40 to 50, and I think they're like at 45, if I remember right. But change is hard, so I've only gotten a couple of phone calls so far of angry folks, but
What's the transportation plan gonna look like there? What's
Yeah.
ingress egress?
yeah. So it's one in and out. They did do a TI or transportation impact analysis. Before they did that, our city engineer, traffic folks looked at that to determine if anything extraordinary was needed. The one thing is you're going to see some changing and some grading and whatnot. They're going to be doing some public improvements along the frontage of their property. So they looked at it, and the driveway that's there now that served the property kind of is at the low end and kind of shot up the hill at a weird angle going up there. So it's going to be more centrally located, and based on, I'm not a traffic engineer, but based on site distances and the study that they provided to the city, felt that it's going to adequately work and be safe. I mean, they don't have to put in a traffic signal or anything like that. So yeah, but yeah. They just, like last week, I think they started clearing.
I had a question. I went to Africa and I came back and the sequoia tree on that property had gone away. I know we lost half of it at one time, but really?
Yeah.
They can chop that one down too?
Yeah. That's always one of the hard parts about development. That's kind of what ends up happening.
Yeah, okay. And then while we have these guys here, I have a question on, so we just repaved Berta Lane. Looks like between about, Chamawa and, I don't know, there, but, so we weren't talking about putting any sidewalks, they put a new street, no curbs, no sidewalks, no?
I'd have to defer to Mr. Lawyer, our Public Works Director. I'm not a part of the overall resurfacing process. They generally do, I can kind of speak general to
When we start talking about what these fellows are talking about.
Yeah,
So we build these communities where people walk.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
We don't build,
Right.
because we have walkway up a
Yep.
ways, and
Sidewalk
then you get
stuff,
down
yeah.
to the circle, and there's walkway there.
Yep.
But, in between. you're
Yeah, no,
on the road.
there's the stretch in the little S curve before you get further
Yeah.
to the
And
north.
we just resurfaced that.
Yeah,
that
so
street.
it was, my understanding is it was part of kind of their regular they resurface a certain amount of streets each year based on wear and tear, and sometimes they do a slurry sealing in certain neighborhoods and whatnot. I know my neighborhood I used to live in, my street was long past due, needing some resurfacing work, but whatever. But so when we build new streets, when it's a true widening or a new project, then, we definitely do a lot more with adding in those sidewalks and that infrastructure, which also adds elements for drainage and
When we
whatnot.
start talking about these folks' plan, maybe Mr. Lawyer can come in here and
Yeah,
with that, because there's supposed to be this long-term plan for people to be able to walk between
Sure.
where they live to where they work or where they shop or whatever.
yeah, no, and I think Commissioner Burson, the reality is too, is in our transportation system plan, we have those things already identified as goals and policies and things that we want to do. We know as a community that we have big areas of town that we inherited back when we were the county and not a city that don't have adequate walkways to get kids to school, to get people to the grocery store. It's a matter of funding to really build those things. So, we have gone through the transportation system plan work, through the Salem Keizer Area Transportation Study Group. We go out and we get projects put on kind of the funding cycle and get grant funding. So Verta is in the hopper to be improved from the Parkway up to Dearborn. And when the apartments go in, they're going to be widening their side of the street and adding sidewalks and landscaping and all of that. So that resurfacing, though, doesn't trip it to the point of building a new street. It truly is just maintaining what's there. But it's already identified in our TSP as being an area that, yes, we would want to add those types of things in. Whereas, when new streets come in, they have to be put in. When new development comes in, we require those improvements to be put in.
So if I heard you correctly, you said the developer will be doing the curb gutter sidewalks on
Verta.
the west side.
Yeah.
Okay. But it doesn't do anything on the east side until,
No.
yeah, which makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a developer cost improvements.
Yeah, and there's a certain level that we can get to. There was some kind of big Supreme Court decisions years ago that
Yeah.
cities would ask for too much, and they said you can't ask for that much, so.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Lawyer. Shane, may I
Is your
ask-
mic on?
May I ask about the big parcel up at McNary Golf Course and Cross River Road? Any news on?
Oh, I don't have any news on it. I've had multiple meetings on that property with different folks. Obviously it's been for sale for a while, but I don't have anything that's, I don't know. No, we're talking, you said River Road, right?
No.
Yeah.
Oh,
I love it.
okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you were talking over Windsor Island, okay.
Oh, no.
No, okay,
And I
sorry.
thought it was under contract with contingencies or something is,
That is what I had heard, and I don't know, I'm not sure where it's at now. So, like I said, we've had some feelers out there. We had multiple meetings. When it first got listed, we had a whole bunch of meetings with people. So yeah, I think I'll keep you posted as I know more.
So now that we've derailed you.
Yeah,
Do you
let's
have
go.
anything else?
We're off the rails. Let's do it.
No, I think we all started with that. You got anything else?
No, I think. Yeah, I think the only other thing that I wanted to make sure that everybody knew about, Windsor Island, there's a new mini storage facility going in there down at the end of Lock Haven. So I know there's some
That's
folks
storage.
who've asked questions on those. And then I think you guys pretty much know everything else that's going on. I don't have any big exciting news for anything else, but yeah.
The irony of that almost just cracks me up. Got to build smaller houses, but we got to start building storage units.
I think we definitely have too much stuff because the mini storages, they are popular.
People do
like
buy
to
too
build
much
those.
stuff. I'm guilty of that myself. So.
But yeah, that was kind of it. I mostly wanted to give you an update on the Herbert property and the River Road property because those are really prominent pieces and you may get questions on those. And, the Herbert property on Verda, we've been waiting for a while, wondering when things were going to move. And like, I've got files on my desk now. So
and I'm going to harp on this because I travel that part of the road every day. That stretch of River Road, as soon as you cross Lock Haven, becomes kind of like almost demolition derby. Like you are literally fighting for your life between Lock Haven and trail there as it goes up Wheatland and it does the split. I'm really concerned about left turn coming off that apartment complex, and then especially if we add additional down there at trail, that's going to be a bloody nightmare.
Yeah.
Like right now, I actually leave work 45 minutes after I'm out of work because otherwise I sit at the stoplight between McNary and going up Wheatland for 20 minutes, and it's just not really that fun. It's going to get way worse if we start doing that mixed-use development down there. I know we're looking at some improvements on trail, and I know that's part of the overall TSP.
Yep.
But I have a lot of concerns about that left turn coming out of those apartments coming onto River Road, because the majority of the accidents you see in that area are people dodging through 7-Eleven to try to avoid, the 3 seconds they have to wait at a stoplight. I'm personally very sensitive to that.
Yeah.
Just because I think that it's terrible up that area.
Hey, you and me both, man. I know. I drive it every day
That's
too.
right. Yeah, you do.
But I moved, so now I don't have to deal with the Wheatland split. I get to go upriver, and it's much easier.
Yeah, it's not.
You should just move to the other side.
Accident last night up at McGee.
Yeah. I mean, and having the four-way at Clear Lake has been great.
Yeah, that's really helped.
And I can tell you, the theory is if we drop it down to 25, that ain't going to make a snowball's difference because people are going 50, 55 on that stretch regularly. You get over the top of the hill and it's a race down to Lock Haven.
Sure. And I think the thing to remember too, our transportation system plan does call for improvements to the overall system and realignment of trail and moving of the signal. Those are things that have been identified in the TSP since 2009. Of course, funding to accomplish those things is a whole different ballgame, and it's very expensive. And, you know, depending on what happens with private development and when those things trigger is kind of that, I don't know, that magic, like, oh, if this happens, then this could happen and it would really improve it. Obviously, the flip side is that as we sit as a city and we have properties that are able to be developed,
Yep.
and we are, you know, we're pretty pro property owners of, you know,
Yep.
hey, let's be flexible with folks to let them do what they can do. So, I mean, I think that's the hard thing. I mean, and like I said, Mr. Lawyer, I'm not a traffic engineer, but I know that was looked at by our city engineer, and I do not disagree with you anecdotally. I know Councilor Johnson and I, we joke a lot about how we are traffic engineers on the side, especially him. But so, I mean, I think it's a valid point, and, you know, I'll chat with Public Works Director Lawyer and see if they had any data on that and get back to you on it.
And may I chime in on that too?
1 second. Commissioner Grants.
What would increase the developability of the Elevate piece would be an urban growth boundary expansion in that area of town.
We're just going to keep going. Next question.
Thank you, Chair Lawyer. Well, I would like to second Matt's concern, because if we add now, 112 units, so minimum 112 more cars going through that intersection at Lock Haven and River, and that parking lot into 7-Eleven is already too close to the light, so people are speeding up to go through the light, and then somebody's trying to slow down to turn into 7-Eleven. And so there is just propensity for rear-end accidents right there, especially if we're adding 100 more cars on the road.
That the project on River Road is actually 66, so it's
Oh,
only
66,
only
okay.
half as bad.
Oh, right.
So
Right, only
Well, and
66 more.
It does have the added benefit of there is a bus stop right there. I mean, but it, you have to go north to go south. But
yeah,
I'm looking at cumulative impacts. We have 60 units, and then we're looking at that big mixed use there at Trail. And unfortunately, it's like there's only so much dollars in SCATs and safe routes to schools, and it's becoming even harder to qualify for those things as jurisdictions. There's just a lot of challenges.
I think
Good luck.
It's already a little dangerous coming out of
Inland
like Salem,
Shores.
Inland Shores, where Salem Clinic is, people trying to go left out of there. And that new place is right across the street from that, right? Pretty much. So I would love to see a light right there, which would solve the Inland Shores problem and the new apartment
I think it's too
complex
close,
issue.
isn't it?
yeah. I mean, so again, this is like Shane is talking way too much
not a
transportation
transportation
tonight,
engineer
but
either.
we'll go for it. Generally, when signals go in, there's kind of a pretty prescriptive method that the traffic engineers look at called a signal warrant to determine if the traffic generated warrants an actual traffic signal. In that location, there's a few things that really aren't helpful. There's another traffic signal right there. We already have identified in our TSP that the traffic signal at McNary Estates Manzanita should be pulled back to the south further to separate from the Wheatland traffic signal. And then in the TSP, there's also, which speaks to Mr. Lawyer's concern, there's actually already plans in place that in our planning horizon, which, TSPs are good for, they're basically a 20-year look. They're a long-range plan. So we say, hey, we need to build all these things based on projected population growths and what we think traffic's going to do and what development's going to do over this planning horizon. And so it's very difficult because then the real world happens and developers come in and properties get sold and they get bought and somebody comes and says, oh, I'm going to build this instead. And so that's why we update them every so often. So the reality is that with the movement of that signal that's been identified in our currently adopted TSP, with the addition of an additional turn lane onto Wheatland to help with stacking and backup and separation to allow for more stacking, and with the cut through that's planned to basically take off where Verta daylights onto Lock Haven, that would cut kind of through the field and around the big apartment complex on Trail and daylight at that new signal, those elements in the TSP are designed to work together to relieve a big amount of the congestion and the traffic that bottlenecks at Lock Haven and River, which makes that intersection operate at a lower level of service currently, especially at 5 o'clock, which speaks to the folks coming from downtown Salem coming home going north and the people coming off the freeway going home going north. The idea is that it would filter folks off, move them around that intersection, and basically spread out the traffic so there is less issue with vehicular conflict, less congestion, less waiting, all of that. Now, the hard part is the practical, and that's that we do not have, I mean, I tried, guys. I tried to win the Mega Millions a couple weeks ago when it was up over $1 billion. And if I had $1 billion, well, I wouldn't have given it to the city anyway. But if the city had $1 billion and we could just, and I don't think that's even enough maybe, but if we had unlimited resources and we could just build everything out in the TSP, oh, that'd be awesome. But we do live in the world of having to procure that funding where we can and when we can, and be really, really strategic about using the funds we have to match those funds with grant money and to work with developers who are doing development to take exactions from them and say, hey, you're going to build this section. So, but I mean, points super well taken. And like I said, I will check on that, the traffic issue on the apartment complex, what was looked at on that. Like I said, I know we looked at it. I looked at the traffic study. I read it. I was like, okay. It's a traffic study.
All right. So we haven't heard from Commissioner Hutchins or Commissioner Avishon yet. Anything this evening?
No.
I mean, don't feel obligated. It's not compulsory. I was just giving you an opportunity.
You guys keep asking all the good questions.
I'll talk enough for all of you.
I'll send you that Venmo later. Kidding. There's none of that happening. I got Ron next to me. What am I, an idiot? All right. We have no city councilor this evening, and so Councilor Herb, you good for next Monday?
Yes.
All right. Well, if there's no other further, September, what do we got?
Yes, I mean, we're planning to have a meeting in September. I do have like kind of a small tweak text amendment that I think I'm going to have to bring you guys back. If that's good with everybody. I know it sounded like Debbie had said there was a couple people missing for the September meeting, but
I know I got one, yeah.
I think as long as we still have a quorum, I'm just planning on
I
it.
am in town. I go to California the next week.
Okay. And then, I know the one other thing I was going to say on my staff update, because City Councilor Duran is not here, and I assume it has to do with the big party and Keizer
Yeah, that's
Fest, because
happening.
I know he's super busy. So I'll say it if nobody else does. Don't forget it's Keizer Fest.
Yep,
This
Keizer
week,
Fest,
so-
tomorrow through Sunday, and
Yeah.
River Road will be closed
River Road will
on
be closed, I think,
Saturday.
at 9 on Saturday. I
Yep.
think that's right, at 9?
No, I think it's later than that.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
No, it's fine.
Is it 9?
Yeah. 'Cause
Oh,
you
the
asked
race,
before.
that's
I
right.
feel like I saw something come across my desk that said it was 9, so,
You're right.
anyway, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's all, sorry.
Great. Well, we'll stand adjourned at 7:22. Thank you all. Good seeing you.